So I completed this bike a few weeks ago and accidentally deleted the videos. So I'll rebuild this bike again. And what I want to do is show you that with that saddle that came with this bike, I ended up scraping off all the defective material and then recoating it with this black RTV silicone rubber using a cardboard scraper to apply it with. And you let it cure for a few days and it works pretty well. It's not permanent, but it works pretty well. I'll also install some caged pedals as well as the front and rear rack. Okay, so I'll install some pedals. I've got a piece of beeswax and I'll just scrape it onto the threads of the pedals. And it doesn't take much. Okay. So there's a left side and a right side to the pedals. With caged pedals it's pretty easy, but if you look at the spindle, on one side, on one spindle, you'll see that there's a letter L, meaning left. Sometimes they're not marked, so there'll be serrations in the spindle that'll indicate L for left. Okay, to install these fast, my method is you screw this in, the right side is clockwise, get your pedal wrench, and then pedal backwards. And this will self-tighten to remove pedal forward. Okay, so that one's done. And we'll do the left side. Screw this in going forwards, and then pedal backwards. And tighten it a little bit. That's good. Okay, same thing with the saddle. I'll clean off the rails a little bit. Rub some beeswax on it just so it doesn't stick. The saddle you want to be level, and you can start with pushing it all the way back and then slowly moving it forward once you start riding it. You can use a bubble level, but generally just get it in the ballpark, and then once you start riding it, you can start making the adjustments for the angle that you see that feels best. Alright, so that's pretty good for now, and then I'll fine tune it while on the road. When installing a rack on a bike, you're going to need 4 screws, 2 up on the seat stay and 2 on the lower frame, and they take different lengths. So on the seat stay, this will be a 1-inch or 25mm screw, and on the non-drive side it'll use a 15mm screw, and on the drive side you use a 20mm screw. So apply some beeswax to it. There are 3 ways that I know of to installing a rack with screws. One is the method used by the bike shop, which is the fastest but least reliable method, and then there's the other 2, and I'll show you the second version here. So if I've applied beeswax on the threads of this screw, and the first thing, this is a 25mm screw, I'll screw this all the way in, and you can do this fairly quickly by hand. And once that's in, screw it in so that it's seated, and you'll see that there's a fair amount of screw left over. Then put a nut over this on each side. Okay. And we'll install this on the other side as well. Okay. Alright, so these are M5 screws, and so I'll tighten these up a little bit. We don't need to apply a lot of torque to it. There's not a lot of weight placed on this from the rack. Okay. From here you can put on the rail on one side a flat washer, followed by another nut. Okay, and then we'll do the other side here. So, another flat washer and another nut. Use the side of your fingers to get this started, and then use an 8mm wrench or a 9, depending on the nut size, to tighten this up. And you can apply a fair amount of torque to this. Okay. So this rack rail is sandwiched between a nut, and the reason why is because in case this does break, you can still reattach it with a nut again, because you have a spare nut. But I've never seen one of these break up here. Down below they have. On the non-drive side, this is a 20mm screw. On the non-drive side, and I moved the racket out of the way, is I'll screw this in from the inside out. And this is using a stainless steel hex screw. You could use a flat screw head instead, which is a lower profile, and that's what's preferred on the drive side. So if you're going to buy some, you can buy these online in 10 packs, and you can buy brass with flat screw heads. Okay, so on this one we'll seat it and we'll tighten it down, and these have been pre-waxed with some beeswax. We'll get a nut, and screw a nut in there, so that's backed. Okay, and we'll seat that down. And you tighten this up here. Okay, lower the rack in place and hook it in. We'll put on a flat washer. I've got a keeper nut here. It's not necessary, you could use a regular flat nut. Then we'll screw this in place. The rack itself should be flat, and so you can use a bubble level on level ground to move this to take the angle away. Okay, so this side is done. Okay, to install the drive side part of the rack, I'm using another M5. This is a 16mm length screw. I've got a nut, which is about 5mm. I've got a washer, which is around 1mm, and when you combine that with the thickness of the flange on the rack and the braze-on, when the screw is all the way down, all the way embedded, there should be no screw exposed on the gear side or on the chain to interfere. So the first thing you do, okay, is put the screw on in the rack, put in a washer, okay, and put on the nut. Okay, and screw this down, not all the way, because you still need to screw this into the the brace on. Now move the rack so that the screw is in line with the brace on, and carefully screw it in. There we go. You may need to loosen up the nut as it gets closer to getting into the frame. It will automatically tighten itself in. Alright, and that's pretty good. The reason why we do this is because this gives you some margin of error in case the screw breaks off. It'll break off at the rack side, and so instead of being stuck in the brace on, when that happens, then you can remove the nut with a pair of pliers, remove the stub of the screw that's embedded, and replace it with another screw, and disaster is averted. To install the front rack, I'll remove the front wheel so that I have more access space to it. The fork on this Trek has a threaded hole, so I can use an M6 that's relatively short and thread that in. So I'll fish in the front brake transverse cable and screw this in, and then tighten it up with a wrench. Usually this will be a 10mm wrench or number 2 Phillips. Okay, this is pretty good. You won't know what size hose clamp you'll need to attach this until you figure out where this is going to meet, and then you can go to the hardware store, measure the diameter with a ruler, and buy the right size. And so in this case, this works pretty well. Here and here. Sometimes if it doesn't fit, if it's just a little bit too large, you can wrap the fork blade with some electrical tape. Okay, and so what we'll do is we'll install one screw, a nut, and do that on the other side as well, and then we'll add a second nut to lock it against each other so that it doesn't come loose, because over time the vibration could cause your the nut or the fastener to wobble free, and then that would cause a problem on the road. Okay. What you'll notice is, if you're sensitive enough, you'll notice that this rack will tend to make your bike ride more firmly, because even though it's a piece of metal here, it's connected at the bottom, at the top, it isolates the fork tine a little bit, and so you'll notice that you'll have a rougher ride. But you know, it's not going to be very much, and you shouldn't really notice it, but I notice it. Of course, once you're loaded up touring, it becomes a non-issue. All right. So this is tight. And this is tight. I'll back it with another nut. And then we'll tighten it up so that it doesn't wiggle free. Okay. So here I've got an 8mm wrench. We'll tighten that up against the 10mm nut that's already installed on this. And that's pretty high reliability there. Now you can reinstall the front wheel. Lock that down. And so I'll reinstall the brake cable. The quickest way to do this, once it's installed, is to install the cable so it's fairly tight. Okay, and then we'll attach the transverse cable. This isn't quite right here. Okay, so now when I apply the brake, the cable's a little tight. I know that. And so what I'll do is I'll loosen this just a little bit so that when I squeeze the brake lever, I can feel the cable draw through between my fingers. And when the gap, when I still have a small amount of gap on the lever when I squeeze hard, I can tighten this up. Okay. And now when I spin the wheel, I have no brake rub and good braking action. One item that I want to point out is the grips were gummy, however they weren't torn. And so what I've done is taken some inner tube and cut it the length of the grip, as well as another piece that was as long as the shifter, and stretched it and spread it over the grip. And so it acts as a sleeve. Alright, and I have another piece of inner tube material that I cut about 20 millimeters wide that I can use as a parking brake, so I can pull this along around the brake lever and it holds the bike in place. And so it's especially helpful when I'm loading up the panniers. I don't want the bike to shift. I can just lock up the front and rear brakes using this type of large rubber band. Okay, but this works really well. I'm satisfied with the result, and it didn't cost anything. Okay, so like I said earlier in the video, this is a reenactment because I've used this bike several times, loaded up with homegrown vegetables to deliver to the food bank, and that was around 35 pounds front and rear panniers, and the bike rides well. Unloaded, the bike rides terrific, but that's not the point of this video, because you want to use this to go cycle camping with. And so this is more than capable as a touring bike, and the more you use it, then you'll come up with ideas of upgrades that you want to put on. But until you realize whether or not you enjoy doing this, try to keep the expenses low, and this is what I've done in this series of videos. So I hope you enjoy this, and in the meantime, happy cycling.